or the --CSV optional argument. We'll demonstrate using these commands in part 2 of this tutorial. As a reminder, the commands at the bottom of the screen can be used to manage the config store from the command line. For more information or a demonstration of these commands, refer to the driver framework tutorial. So hopefully in part 1, you've begun to understand more about BACnet networks and the VOLTTRON BACnet driver system. For this presentation today, I'm just going to go ahead and skip right into part 2, which would be our practical demo. In the case of the video series, these would actually be split into 2 different videos. Bear with me one moment here. So this section hasn't been fully scripted yet, but we can go through essentially the process that I'll be demonstrating at that point. We will assume that you've already installed the VOLTTRON instance, you've activated the virtual environment, and that you've started that instance. So I'm going to tail the log file on the other side so I can kind of see things as they're happening. All right, so the first step that I'm going to demonstrate is making use of the utility scripts to generate some config files and do some device discovery. So the way that this will work is that I'm going to use the utility, the BACnet scan utility, with an address actually at PNNL that we're going to use for the demo. Then I'm going to output into that CSV file like I've said before. And before we do that, I'm going to copy the default BACnet backpipes INI file into a directory, and then I'm going to take a look at that so I can demonstrate some of what we saw in the first half. So all of these values are the defaults that actually come from backpipes. It happens to be the case that because I'm running, or in the way my VM is currently stood up, the address that I want to use is actually already correct. This object name is, it just so happens that Joel's team likes to use stars. So that's why it's this interesting string here. But for the purposes of the demo, that's totally fine. So I'm just going to stick with that. Then I'm going to run our scan script. Give it the address of the remote network. A CSV file to use later with the grab multiple configs. And the INI file that I copied into the config directory. It is perfectly reasonable to instead change the present working directory to this script/BACnet scan. And while in that directory, you do not need to have this --ini config, this whole thing. It will just use the one that's already there. The reason I have done this way is that I find it useful to have a single place where I've kind of aggregated all of my configs and all of my metadata. So you'll see in the standard out that it's able to do a who is I am cycle with this device, and it outputs a whole bunch of metadata about what that device is expecting. A lot of this information will be kind of similar to what you saw in the first part. So we see the device's IP address, we see its BACnet device ID. We see that it supports packet segmentation. It has a length of 1024 bytes for its packets, and it has vendor ID 5. These vendor IDs are, as I said previously, specified by ASHRAE, and basically how that tends to work is that a company that produces BACnet equipment will go request an ID, and the organization will just essentially assign them some arbitrary integer. I believe that 5 corresponds to Johnson Controls devices, although I don't know that I could be quoted on that. But in any case, if we now take a look at our config directory, we should see that we have a CSV file with devices we found. In this case, we only found one, and that's the device we'll be using to get some configs. So I'm going to use grab multiple configs because I think it's a good demonstration of how to use these things in combination with each other. But in the case of a single device or a small number of devices, you could choose to just use grab BACnet config. That's totally fine. I just find it to be a bit more work. So we'll again use a script in the script/BACnet directory. We're going to use grab multiple configs.py. The first argument that is always required if you're using this utility is the path to that scanning output. So I will give it that. I'm going to give it the out directory optional argument. And what that will do is you can say, hey, I want to collect all of my BACnet configs that are generated into a single place that I'm specifying rather than whatever the default is for the script. I'm going to use that same config directory. As the script generates these config files, it will further subdivide this directory into a devices directory and a registry configs directory, and the configs generated will be allocated to those corresponding to their types. I'm going to give it the ini file that we copied over previously, and that should be good to go. So what this script actually does under the hood is it essentially calls grab BACnet config.py several times, and that will use that CSV data as the input rather than using the command line. And then it will send these read property requests to points on that device and collect their metadata, which we can see here. So we can see, hey, there's the source of the packet. Is it expecting a reply? No. What's the type of packet? What's the service request type, and a whole bunch more stuff. All of this information will be captured as a BACnet registry config file. And also it will have already generated the device config file. So we can take a look at those as well. By default, or the behavior for the naming conventions is that it will use the BACnet device ID. So in this case, the device configuration, the driver configuration is just literally that identifier number. And there's our driver config. make sure to, when you're loading these configs into the config store, you're going to have to use the registry config pattern to store that config file. So it will, out of this script, it will always use registry underscore configs, the device ID, and then the CSV extension. For the registry config, again, it will use that same device ID. It will just give you the CSV extension. I know this is going to be a little bit hard to look at, but this will be things like your BACnet point name, the VOLTTRON point name, the index offset on the device, the whatever notes that the device has provided us, the object type, the property type, and so on. And you can kind of see them in there if you look closely enough. So object type, property type, present value, whether or not it's writable, and the offset. Okay, so now we have a generated device and registry config that we can use. As we saw in the previous section, the next thing that we need is to set up the BACnet proxy agent. And to do so, we'll need its configuration file. So I'm going to copy the default. So that would be services for BACnet proxy / config. I'm going to copy that into the config directory, and I'm going to give it a more descriptive name. I'm going to make sure that it looks how I want it to. And I do want it to bind to a local socket. I want it to have the packet length that was output in my device metadata. This sort of this identifier we know is unique because the only device on that network is 506.892. The object name for this, the default one is going to be the VOLTTRON BACnet driver. If you have multiple of these BACnet drivers, you'll really want to select a different one. The BACnet specification says that they should be unique. I'm going to just maintain using the 5 vendor ID. This isn't obviously a Johnson Controls or some other vendor's device, but it is something that we need to provide. And we need to maintain this because our devices support packet segmentation. I'm going to leave this as it is. This is a good thing to have potentially. So. If your devices do not support this, though, please do make sure to change this to something appropriate for that network. Okay, so we've got all of the configuration files we need. So now we need to go about installing some agents. I'm going to install 3 agents, the BACnet proxy, which we've talked about, the platform driver, which we've talked about, and I'm going to also install a copy of the listener agent so that we can see the output of the driver system to the message bus. I really like making use of tags. That will be particularly handy if you have multiple copies of the BACnet proxy, just because it can be a real pain to have to deal with their identities on an individual level. But I think just kind of handy often anyway. The listener agent doesn't require, for our use case, any additional configuration, so I'm just going to leave that exactly as it is. For the platform driver does have its own configuration, so I will also copy that from its directory. to the config directory that I've created, and then I will install that agent with that config. I'm just going to use the default one. That's frequently a pretty good start. Okay. And now we need to install our BACnet proxy. It is actually important to spell things correctly, something that seems to be unavoidable during demo. Okay. So we've got our agents. Now we need to manage our configuration files. I'm going to demonstrate a few things that are also covered in the driver tutorial, but useful for this as well if the user hasn't already seen that tutorial. For instance, it is the case that you may already have some configs in the platform drivers config store. If you want to continue using, communicating with those devices, you can certainly leave them there. In my setup here, I'm assuming that you've installed a copy of the fake driver to do some testing. You're probably no longer interested in that because you're probably interested in working with your real devices. So I'm going to just go ahead and remove those. I list them again, and I should see that they are gone. Excellent. So now we need to add our driver config and registry config. So vctl config store platform.driver. I'm going to use the sort of standard naming convention that we recommend, which is devices/campus/building. And then our device ID. I think for BACnet, using the actual device ID number is probably a good way to go. And then the path to our config file. All right. I can go ahead and take a look at the contents of that. Okay, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to just go ahead and store my registry config. The previous command can be useful if for some reason you forget the registry config naming convention from the script. The path to that configuration file. And the -csv option. You'll see as these configs are being loaded, the very verbose logging will dump their entire contents to the log. So in some ways, a good way of determining that your config is being stored. I'm going to also demonstrate that there is a capability to edit the a stored configuration file. So you would use whatever you've stored that as. That would be the first of these two arguments following platform driver. I believe I made an error. There we go. Okay. In this case, I'm not actually going to edit it, but if you were to make changes here, you would be able to, those would take effect in the config store. So this can be pretty helpful for debugging purposes, especially. All right, so we've got our configs, we've got our agents. I like to, when I'm starting these things specifically for BACnet, I like to start the listener and proxy first. And the reason for that is that you will see, if you start the platform driver agent before the proxy starts, you can see errors as it tries to go find that agent to start sending requests. So I'm going to use the tags that I installed the agents with, but you could also use their sort of unique identifier over here, or identity if you wanted to. Okay, so you can see the BACnet proxy starting up with our configuration values. And now it should be the case that if I start the platform driver, we should, after some short delay, see some data output to the message bus. You can see it received a whole bunch of requests, and we now have our point, in this case, metadata. It's dumping so much to the screen that we don't actually see the values, but we do see the tail end of that request, which is the point metadata. So we are currently seeing that we are successfully scraping a remote device on the BACnet network. And I'm going to stop there. And since I haven't yet scripted this portion, I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation there and open this up for any questions or comments.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so any portions of that people had questions on, anyone who's tried to use the BACnet drivers and set that up or thinking about it?
Hey, James, this is Ben. I just had like one question kind of related to like the listener agent. I think this is really basic, but so like if you enable the listener agent, is it through the listener agent config file that you can use it to display only like debugging or errors or info? Like, for example, if you're developing some agent code and you only wanted the listener agent to look for like debugs, is there any chance you could touch on that at all?
So with the listener agent config, I believe it might be the case that you can change the topics that are captured by that agent. But if you want to change the log level, you actually need to do that through the way you start the platform. So if you're using what is it, /start VOLTTRON from the VOLTTRON root, that starts with very verbose logging by default. So I think that is all the way down to debug. Craig can probably correct me, but I believe it's the case that if you're just to start VOLTTRON using the VOLTTRON command and no additional verbose options, that it would actually just start with info level logging.
And the listener agent, correct. And it's separate from what, so the listener agent is listening to all messages on the message bus. and publishing those out at info level, I believe, right?
Yeah, that can be
Logging it
configured.
at info.
Sorry,
can be
logging it in.
configured.
And so that there's a difference between the messages that the listener agent is subscribing to and what's being output into the log.
So you can
So-
modify the listener to actually output things at output all of the published message at info level rather than debug level. And I believe it does
Yes, you can do
info level
that.
by default, right? But
It's
I can't
info level
remember.
by default.
Yeah, but you could publish it at whichever level you want to.
Got it. So like if you just want to look at debug info only, you can do that too.
Well, the way it works is if you say info, then it's info, error, and warn that you'll be able to see. If you say debug, then it's debug info. It's all of them. So debug is the most verbose that Python actually gives you. So it doesn't. It's not quote unquote only, but it gives you all of it. But one thing that you can do is you can use the Unix tools and pipe and grep to filter those out further.
Got it. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's typically, if I'm debugging something, I'll have everything going to the log, and I'll just use a grep on the file and just see the messages that I care about. All right.
Were there any comments pertaining to the content of the presentation or its organization, anything like that? Those sorts of things would be super helpful for me to have to evaluate the script and to produce better content for you going forward.
I thought it looked good for new people like myself. I think like understanding like the registry configs in the config store is kind of confusing. I think like a couple office hours ago, there might have been one where someone displayed a chart that kind of, I can't remember who was talking about it. It was like a chart basically on like how everything is kind of put together, and that kind of made things click for me, like what the registry configs do in the config store. So any kind of like a visual representation too is kind of helpful.
I was feeling just that. I was thinking the overall flow. Before we go into details, if we can put the overall flow in a diagram, saying, okay, these are all the pieces that are going to be interacting, and so this proxy agent talks to this, and driver interface talks to this, and this uses the config store to grab the details, and then it goes like the data flow, right, of the whole thing, like an overall flow. And that could be something that we could start with. That way you introduce, like, these are all the components that are in play, and then you can go into details of each one, what options each one have. I mean, that's one thing that I felt could help with, because that way you have the big picture in the background when the details of each one is discussed.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Any questions? Anything that I didn't cover that people had questions about or have struggled with? I agree that the config store does tend to be a bit of a sticking point for people.
All right. Well, and then if people don't have anything right now, but you think of something later, let us know. Or when that video is published, if you have some comments, just also let us know. We're always looking for what the people in the community run into that we need to make sure that we cover. It's always very useful information.
Yeah, I have like one more question. I don't, James, if you have a minute, like you posted something on Stack Overflow for, why doesn't the BACnet proxy come up on a BACnet discovery? Like if you're running VOLTTRON and you have like a BACnet discovery on a, why doesn't it respond to like a who is request?
Why doesn't it discover itself, basically?
Well,
Uh,
No, he's asking why doesn't a third party tool discover it? But I've always seen it does show up.
it does
Is it
show
not
up.
showing up?
Maybe I just have
sus-
like a firewall or problem with the VOLTTRON instance on my test bench at home. Like I also have like another Windows computer with a BACnet discovery tool, and I was just kind of curious why I can't discover VOLTTRON BACnet proxy through my BACnet discovery tool.
So I'll definitely take a look at the Stack Overflow post. My initial gut reaction is that it might be something with the way that the network is actually organized. But yeah, I'll go look at that post.
Yeah, I know you mentioned that BACnet has like a lot of callbacks or something like that. It was kind of interesting reading. I don't really know backpipes under the hood, so it's just kind of interesting to hearing from y'all's perspective. They'll probably know it a little, understand it a bit better than I do.
I don't know, Ben, I think you were using this for something, but for those who, in addition to Ben, who have been using BAC0 as well, as it turns out, BAC0 actually has a dependency on backpipes. So a lot of these concepts will apply to that if you've chosen to work with BAC0.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Sure thing.
All right. Great. Well, thanks a lot, James. And thanks everybody for feedback. And if you have any suggestions for future topics or research that you'd like to present, we're always interested in hearing what people are doing. And it's a good chance to get out in front of the community. Just let us know. Otherwise, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good week,
Bye.
everyone.